In the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles, California, the year was 2019. The story revolves around an elderly man named Richard Wallace, a wealthy businessman who had built his fortune through decades of investments in real estate and private companies. At the age of 72, Richard was respected in his community, often seen as a calm and generous figure. Despite his age, he lived in comfort inside a large home, surrounded by valuable possessions that reflected the success of his career. Richard's personal life, however, had changed recently. Only a few months earlier, he had married a much younger woman named Elena, who was 28 years old. Their marriage attracted attention, not only because of the large age gap but also because many people questioned Elena's true intentions. Neighbors and friends described the union as unusual but kept their opinions to themselves. The wedding had taken place in a small private ceremony attended only by a handful of close acquaintances. Richard, who had lived alone for many years after his first wife's passing, seemed happy to have companionship again. For him, the marriage was a chance to fill the silence of his home and to share his later years with someone who cared for him. But behind the walls of their home, a different story was beginning to unfold. The differences in age, lifestyle, and expectations between Richard and Elena would soon create conflicts. What started as a marriage filled with promise would eventually lead to suspicion, betrayal, and tragedy. Richard Wallace lived in Los Angeles, in a two-story house located in a quiet residential neighborhood. His home was surrounded by well-kept gardens and tall fences that provided him privacy. Richard had lived in the same place for over 30 years. The house was not only his residence but also a symbol of his lifetime achievements. He had retired from business several years earlier, but he still managed some of his investments and often met with financial advisors. At 72, Richard maintained a routine that was simple. His days usually began with a slow breakfast while reading the morning newspaper, followed by a short walk around the neighborhood. He enjoyed gardening, reading, and occasionally visiting local community events. Richard was a widower. His first wife, Margaret, had passed away more than 10 years before, and since then he had lived alone. People who knew him described him as a disciplined man, careful with his choices, and quiet in his interactions. He did not seek public attention and preferred a private life. Despite his wealth, he lived without excess. His home contained valuable art pieces and antique furniture, but Richard was not interested in showing them off. For him, comfort and familiarity were more important. After years of solitude, Richard eventually met Elena, a woman who was much younger than him. Elena was 28 years old, originally from another state, and had moved to California in search of new opportunities. She was described by acquaintances as attractive, social, and ambitious. Before meeting Richard, she had worked in several temporary jobs, often changing workplaces. She presented herself as someone who desired stability and a new beginning. Their meeting was said to have happened through social contacts, possibly at a private gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances. Richard, despite his age, enjoyed conversations and was often polite toward younger people who showed him attention. Elena quickly developed a close relationship with him, and within months, they began appearing together at restaurants and local events. Their relationship developed rapidly, and soon after, Richard announced his intention to marry her. Friends of Richard were surprised by the decision. They knew him as someone who usually moved carefully and rarely acted impulsively. Some of them questioned whether the marriage was truly based on affection or if other motivations were involved. However, Richard defended his choice. He explained that Elena gave him company, energy, and a sense of happiness that he had not experienced in years. The wedding was small, private, and modest compared to Richard's financial status. It was held in mid-2019 at a local registry office, followed by a dinner attended only by a few close friends and acquaintances. Elena became Mrs. Wallace, and soon after, she moved into Richard's house. For Richard, the marriage represented a fresh chapter in his life, one that promised companionship and warmth. In the beginning, the household seemed stable. Richard continued with his daily habits while Elena adjusted to her new environment. She managed certain aspects of the home, redecorated some rooms, and became more visible in social settings as Richard's wife. Neighbors noticed her presence quickly, as she was much younger and more outgoing compared to Richard's quiet personality. Over time, however, small differences became apparent. Richard's lifestyle was structured and calm. He valued routine, careful financial planning, and private moments. Elena, on the other hand, preferred social gatherings, shopping, and engaging with people outside the home. While Richard was content with quiet evenings, Elena often expressed interest in traveling, attending parties, and living more freely. Despite these differences, Richard made efforts to adapt. He allowed Elena more freedom to manage household expenses and occasionally accompanied her to social events, although he often returned early due to fatigue. On the surface, their marriage looked functional. To outsiders, they were simply an unusual couple with a significant age gap. Inside the home, however, tension slowly began to appear. Financial matters became one of the sensitive points in their relationship. Richard's wealth was substantial, consisting of real estate, company shares, and savings accumulated over decades. Elena, while officially his wife, had limited access to these resources. Richard managed his finances with strict control, relying on trusted advisors and long-standing legal arrangements. Elena often asked questions about his assets and future plans, and though Richard answered politely, he avoided giving her full control. In addition to financial differences, there was also the matter of trust. Richard's friends and advisors occasionally warned him to be cautious, pointing out that the marriage had progressed unusually fast. Some advised him to update legal documents carefully, ensuring that his assets remained secure. Richard acknowledged these concerns but also reminded his friends that he was aware of the risks. He believed he could manage the situation and trusted his own judgment. Meanwhile, Elena presented herself as a devoted wife in public. She accompanied Richard to medical appointments, participated in community gatherings, and appeared supportive. At the same time, she maintained private communication with people outside Richard's circle, which raised quiet suspicion among some neighbors. Although nothing seemed openly wrong, her behavior sometimes created questions about her true intentions. The initial months of their marriage established the foundation of their relationship: an elderly wealthy man seeking companionship in his later years, and a young woman who appeared to provide it but whose personal goals were less clear. While Richard saw the marriage as a personal choice for happiness, others around him observed signs of imbalance. These early dynamics would later play an important role as events unfolded and tensions escalated inside the Wallace household. As the first year of marriage unfolded, the differences between Richard and Elena slowly became more visible. What had started as small disagreements over lifestyle began to develop into larger issues that touched deeper parts of their relationship. Richard, at 72, preferred quiet routines and financial caution, while Elena, at 28, sought activity, travel, and social recognition. These differences by themselves might not have caused severe problems, but they grew stronger once financial discussions entered the center of their lives. Richard had accumulated significant wealth over decades. He owned several properties, including his main residence, 2 rental homes, and a vacation property outside Los Angeles. In addition, he had savings, investments in stocks, and a trust account that had been carefully managed for years. For Richard, these assets were not only material possessions but the result of his discipline and lifelong work. He was determined to maintain control over them, especially after hearing advice from financial advisors who often reminded him about potential risks of mismanagement. Elena, however, had a different view. As Richard's wife, she felt entitled to a larger role in household finances. She argued that she should be involved in decisions about property, investments, and daily expenses. At first, her requests were small, such as asking for access to certain credit cards or the ability to make larger purchases without Richard's approval. Richard allowed some of these requests but kept restrictions in place. Over time, Elena became increasingly frustrated with what she saw as a lack of trust. The triggering event began with a series of conversations about Richard's estate plan. Richard's financial advisor encouraged him to update his will, considering his new marital status. Richard agreed, but he was cautious about the details. He wanted to provide security for Elena in the event of his death, but he also wanted to preserve part of his estate for extended family members and charitable causes. When Elena learned about the draft of the new will, she was not satisfied. According to the draft, she would receive a comfortable allowance and certain assets, but she would not gain full control of Richard's entire fortune. This discovery created visible tension in the Wallace household. Elena confronted Richard directly. She expressed anger that after becoming his wife, she was still treated as if she were outside of his inner circle. Richard responded calmly, explaining that his decisions were based on responsibility and long-term planning. He reminded her that wealth could be misused if not handled carefully. The conversation ended without agreement, leaving both sides unsettled. Following this disagreement, Elena's behavior began to change. She became more distant in her interactions with Richard, sometimes avoiding conversations altogether. In social settings, she maintained her role as a supportive wife, but inside the home, her frustration grew stronger. Richard noticed these changes and tried to bridge the gap by offering small compromises, such as planning short vacations or giving Elena more spending freedom. However, the central issue of wealth control remained unresolved. The situation escalated further when Elena began making larger purchases without Richard's consent. On one occasion, she transferred a significant sum of money from a joint account into her personal account. Richard confronted her and demanded an explanation. Elena argued that as his wife, she should have the right to use the funds as she saw fit. Richard disagreed and immediately moved to limit her access. He contacted his bank to adjust account permissions and instructed his financial advisor to monitor transactions more closely. This decision deepened the conflict. Elena felt humiliated and restricted. She started spending more time away from home, meeting friends, and engaging in activities outside Richard's circle. Neighbors noticed her absences and remarked that she often returned late at night. While these behaviors were not immediately alarming, they revealed a widening gap in the marriage. The breaking point came when Richard received information from his financial advisor that Elena had inquired about the value of certain properties and insurance policies. The advisor warned Richard to be careful, as such questions suggested deeper interest in his estate. Richard confronted Elena again, asking her directly why she was seeking information about his finances. Elena denied any harmful intentions, saying she only wanted to understand the future they were planning together. Yet her defensive tone did little to reduce Richard's suspicion. At this stage, trust between them had weakened significantly. Richard became more protective of his assets and less open in sharing personal information. He also began discussing concerns with a close friend, expressing worry about the stability of his marriage. Elena, on the other hand, felt increasingly excluded and dissatisfied. She began to see her position in the marriage as temporary and insecure, especially after realizing she would not inherit as much as she expected if Richard passed away. This tension formed the foundation for the next stage of conflict. What had begun as normal marital differences, spending habits, lifestyle choices, and age gap, had now turned into a direct clash over money, trust, and control. The dispute over Richard's will and estate planning was the spark that transformed their relationship from uneasy partnership into one filled with suspicion and resentment. Though the situation had not yet reached open hostility, the early signs of a dangerous outcome were already present. Richard's cautious nature clashed with Elena's growing impatience. Each new disagreement added pressure to their fragile marriage. Behind closed doors, the Wallace household was no longer a place of companionship but an environment filled with quiet tension, unspoken conflicts, and unresolved questions about loyalty and intentions. This period marked the beginning of a chain of events that would soon escalate beyond control. The conflict over wealth and inheritance, triggered by the draft of Richard's will, became the dividing line in their relationship. From this moment forward, every interaction between Richard and Elena was shaped by suspicion and growing distrust, setting the stage for decisions and actions that would eventually lead to tragedy. After the dispute about Richard's estate plan, the atmosphere in the Wallace household grew increasingly strained. Although Richard tried to maintain calm, the gap between him and Elena was no longer hidden. Their conversations often ended in silence, and the warmth that Richard once hoped for in his marriage was quickly fading. Richard spent more time outside the house, either visiting his financial advisor or meeting close friends for lunch. He explained to them that Elena had become distant and that he was beginning to doubt her intentions. His friends reminded him to be cautious and to avoid making sudden changes to his financial arrangements. Richard assured them that he had taken steps to secure his estate, but he also admitted that living with Elena had become more difficult. Inside the house, Elena's behavior continued to shift. She no longer showed the same level of affection she had displayed during the early months of the marriage. Instead, she often expressed irritation when Richard denied her requests for greater access to his wealth. She also began inviting her own friends to the house, sometimes without informing Richard. While these gatherings appeared harmless, they made Richard uncomfortable. He valued privacy and order, but Elena valued activity and social interaction. The couple's arguments became more frequent. Most of them centered on money, but some also touched on lifestyle differences. Richard criticized Elena for excessive spending on clothing, jewelry, and travel. Elena responded by accusing Richard of being controlling and unwilling to share his life fully. These arguments did not always end in shouting. Often they ended in long periods of silence where neither side was willing to compromise. Richard's health also began to play a role in the growing tension. At his age, he required regular medical checkups and medication. Elena sometimes accompanied him, but her patience was limited. She would often complain about the time spent at clinics or hospitals. Richard noticed her lack of interest and felt disappointed. He had believed that marriage would bring companionship and care, but instead he often felt isolated even when Elena was present. Elena, meanwhile, began to develop her own plans. She confided in a few close acquaintances that she was unhappy in the marriage and felt trapped. While she enjoyed the comfort of living in Richard's home, she was frustrated by her lack of control over his finances. Her comments suggested that she wanted more independence and access to Richard's assets. Some of her acquaintances later recalled that she spoke openly about her dissatisfaction, though at the time, no one thought it would lead to anything dangerous. The tension escalated when Richard discovered that Elena had been making inquiries with a lawyer about marital property rights. When Richard confronted her, she insisted that she only wanted to understand her legal position as his wife. Richard, however, was alarmed. He saw this as another sign that her interest in the marriage was tied more to financial security than to companionship. Their argument that evening was one of the most serious they had ever had. Richard warned her that if her behavior continued, he would consider separating. Elena reacted with anger, accusing him of being unfair and ungrateful. After this confrontation, the distance between them grew larger. Richard began sleeping in a separate bedroom, explaining that he needed quiet and rest. Elena spent more time outside the home, often telling Richard she was meeting friends or attending events. Richard's neighbors started to notice her frequent absences and the increasing loneliness of Richard's routine. Financial disputes also deepened. Richard reduced Elena's access to joint accounts and insisted that all major expenses required his approval. Elena saw this as humiliation. She began to view Richard not only as an obstacle but also as someone standing between her and a future of independence and wealth. This change in perspective marked an important turning point in her attitude. At the same time, Richard started to consider legal steps to protect himself. He met privately with his attorney to discuss possible adjustments to his will and even raised the idea of drafting a postnuptial agreement. His attorney advised caution and confidentiality. Richard agreed but also expressed his sadness that such measures had become necessary in his marriage. As months passed, the conflict no longer remained hidden. Their arguments became louder, and household staff occasionally overheard heated exchanges. One staff member later recalled that Elena once shouted about being treated like a stranger in her own home. Another noted that Richard responded by saying, "Trust is earned, not given." These small but telling details revealed the breakdown of their relationship. Friends of Richard also noticed his growing concern. During a lunch with one of his long-time business partners, Richard admitted that he felt unsafe in his own home. Although he did not suspect violence at the time, he said that Elena's anger and unpredictability worried him. His friend encouraged him to take stronger protective measures, but Richard, still holding on to some hope for reconciliation, hesitated to take decisive action. Meanwhile, Elena's frustration reached new levels. She began spending more time with acquaintances who encouraged her dissatisfaction. She was heard complaining that her life with Richard was a waste of years if she could not benefit from his wealth. These remarks, though made casually in private settings, revealed her growing resentment and impatience. The tension between them finally reached a breaking point one evening when Richard informed Elena that he intended to make permanent changes to his estate plan. He explained that he would continue to provide for her but that the majority of his fortune would be secured for other purposes. Elena reacted sharply, accusing him of betrayal. The argument ended with Elena leaving the house late at night, slamming the door as she exited. From that moment onward, the marriage no longer functioned even as a fragile partnership. Richard withdrew emotionally and socially, limiting his contact with Elena to essential matters. Elena, in turn, no longer attempted to hide her dissatisfaction. She spoke less about reconciliation and more about her frustration with the situation. By this stage, the Wallace household had become a place of ongoing conflict. Every interaction carried suspicion and resentment. The once quiet home was now filled with tension, unspoken hostility, and a sense of uncertainty. Richard, though cautious, underestimated how far Elena's frustration might drive her. Elena, feeling excluded and denied access to the wealth she desired, began to see only one path forward. This period marked the peak of rising tension, where the fragile balance between caution and resentment collapsed. The next stage would no longer be about arguments or disagreements but about irreversible actions that would determine the future of both Richard and Elena. The breaking point in the Wallace marriage came during the winter of 2020. After months of growing tension, financial disputes, and emotional distance, Richard and Elena's relationship reached an irreversible stage. What had begun as small disagreements had turned into open hostility. Richard had recently finalized an update to his will. The new version secured a modest portion of his estate for Elena but directed most of his wealth to family members, charitable foundations, and long-term trusts. Richard believed this was a balanced solution. He provided for Elena's living needs but ensured his fortune would remain managed according to his principles. When Elena learned of the update, she was furious. She argued that after becoming his wife, she deserved far more than what was written. Richard responded firmly, saying his decision was final. This disagreement led to the most intense argument of their marriage. Witnesses later reported that the couple's voices were heard from outside the house that evening. Richard accused Elena of caring only about money, while Elena accused Richard of humiliating her and treating her as temporary. The argument ended abruptly, with Elena storming out of the room. Over the following days, Elena withdrew further from Richard. She avoided meals with him, spoke little, and spent more time on her phone or outside the home. Richard noticed her coldness but assumed it was another phase of conflict. He did not imagine the extent of her resentment. In reality, Elena was moving toward a decision that would end their marriage in the most destructive way. On a quiet evening in January, the household routine appeared normal. Richard had spent much of the day reading and making phone calls with his financial advisor. Elena prepared dinner, and the two shared a brief meal without much conversation. Later, Richard retreated to his study, a room he often used to read or review documents. Elena, however, had already formed a plan. According to investigators, Elena waited until Richard was alone in the study. She entered carrying a glass of wine, offering it to him as a gesture of peace. Richard, perhaps hoping for a calm moment, accepted it. Unbeknownst to him, the drink contained a sedative substance. Within a short time, Richard became weak and unsteady. Once Richard was incapacitated, Elena attempted to make the scene appear like a natural collapse. She moved objects around the room, tipped over a chair, and left Richard on the floor. Then she called emergency services, reporting that her husband had collapsed suddenly. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Richard was already unresponsive. Despite their efforts, he was pronounced dead at the hospital later that night. At first, the death was recorded as possibly natural due to Richard's age and health history. Elena presented herself as a grieving widow, explaining that Richard had been under stress and was not in strong health. She spoke politely to investigators and attended the initial medical reviews without drawing suspicion. Neighbors who saw her after the event described her as calm, though distant. However, the circumstances did not go unnoticed. Richard's financial advisor and attorney, aware of the recent disputes, raised concerns with authorities. They explained that Richard had been in stable health, regularly attending medical checkups, and that his sudden death seemed unusual. They also reported the tension in his marriage and his expressed worries about Elena's intentions. An autopsy was ordered. The medical examiner discovered traces of sedative substances in Richard's system, levels that were inconsistent with his prescribed medications. This finding immediately changed the direction of the case. Investigators returned to the Wallace residence to gather more evidence. Inside the home they found inconsistencies. The study showed signs of stage disorder rather than a natural fall. Furthermore, searches of Elena's phone revealed internet searches related to sedatives and inheritance laws. Bank records also showed unusual financial activity in the days before Richard's death, including attempts to transfer funds. Confronted with this evidence, Elena's role as a grieving widow quickly unraveled. She was taken into custody for questioning. During initial interviews, she denied involvement, insisting that Richard's death was a tragedy unrelated to her actions. However, the mounting evidence painted a different picture. The climax of the story was not just the act itself but the rapid exposure of Elena's intentions. What she believed might pass as a natural death was revealed as a deliberate act. The discovery shocked the community, Richard's friends, and even neighbors who had suspected tensions but never imagined the situation would escalate to violence. For investigators, the case became clearer with each piece of evidence. Elena's motives were tied directly to Richard's wealth and her dissatisfaction with his estate plan. The sedative traces, the staged study, and her financial activities created a consistent narrative. The woman who had once been introduced as Richard's second chance at companionship was now accused of ending his life for personal gain. This turning point marked the climax of the case. Richard's sudden death, the exposure of Elena's role, and the evidence connecting her actions to financial motives brought the private tensions of the Wallace household into the public eye. The tragedy was no longer hidden within the walls of their home. It became the center of a criminal investigation that would determine Elena's future. After Richard Wallace's death was ruled suspicious, Elena was charged with first-degree murder. The case quickly moved into the legal system, drawing attention because of the large age gap between the couple, the circumstances of their marriage, and the financial disputes that had been uncovered. The prosecution's case was built carefully and relied on a combination of forensic evidence, financial records, and witness testimony. Prosecutors argued that Elena had clear motives: her dissatisfaction with Richard's estate plan, her frustration with limited access to his wealth, and her attempts to secure greater financial control. They emphasized that Richard had recently updated his will, leaving Elena with only a modest portion of his estate, which gave her both reason and urgency to act. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the toxicology report. The medical examiner testified that Richard's body contained sedative substances inconsistent with his prescribed medications. According to the expert, the concentration levels were high enough to cause incapacitation and likely death in a man of Richard's age and health. This finding made the claim of a natural collapse implausible. Investigators also presented digital evidence. Elena's phone records showed searches related to sedatives, including dosage levels and potential effects when combined with alcohol. Additional searches focused on inheritance rights and how property laws functioned in California. These records, dated shortly before Richard's death, strongly suggested planning and intent. Financial documents were another key part of the prosecution's argument. Bank statements revealed attempts by Elena to transfer money from joint accounts to her personal accounts shortly before Richard's death. Although the transfers were blocked due to Richard's financial safeguards, the timing and amounts raised suspicion. Prosecutors argued that Elena was preparing for control of Richard's wealth even before his death. Witness testimony also played an important role. Household staff recounted overhearing arguments between Richard and Elena in the months leading up to his death. One staff member testified that Elena often expressed anger about being left out of Richard's financial decisions. Neighbors also described observing increasing tension, including late-night departures and heated exchanges. Richard's financial advisor and attorney both testified that Richard had expressed concerns about Elena's intentions and had specifically updated his will to limit her control over his estate. The defense attempted to counter these claims by arguing that Elena was a young woman trapped in a difficult marriage with an elderly man. Her attorneys suggested that her behavior, searching online about sedatives and inheritance, could be explained by curiosity or stress. They also argued that the toxicology results could have been the result of accidental misuse of medication, as Richard took several prescriptions for health conditions. However, the defense struggled to provide convincing explanations for the volume of sedative substances found in Richard's system and for the timing of Elena's online activity. The prosecution emphasized that the evidence pointed not to accident but to deliberate planning. During the trial, Elena herself took the stand. She denied poisoning Richard and insisted she had no intention of harming him. She claimed that her online searches were unrelated and that her attempts to access financial accounts were part of her role as his wife. However, under cross-examination, her answers appeared inconsistent. At one point, when asked directly why she had searched for information on sedatives days before Richard's death, she struggled to provide a clear response. The jury listened to weeks of testimony. The case was not filled with dramatic courtroom moments but with steady, methodical presentation of facts. The most persuasive elements were the toxicology report, the staged nature of Richard's study, and the clear financial motive. Together, these details painted a picture of deliberate action. After deliberating for several days, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Elena showed little visible reaction as the verdict was read. The judge later sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his remarks, the judge noted that the case was one of betrayal, where a marriage meant to provide companionship instead ended in violence motivated by financial gain. Following the sentencing, Richard's extended family expressed relief that justice had been served. His friends and advisors spoke publicly about his character, remembering him as a disciplined man who valued both his work and his private life. Many also expressed sadness that his final years, which he had hoped to share with a partner, had ended in such tragedy. The trial outcome also had practical consequences for Richard's estate. Because Elena was convicted of murder, she was legally barred from receiving any inheritance from him. The estate was instead distributed according to his updated will, with funds directed toward family members and charitable foundations. The resolution of the case did not erase the loss but provided clarity. For investigators, prosecutors, and Richard's family, the trial confirmed what the evidence had shown from the beginning: that Richard's death was not natural but the result of deliberate actions by the person closest to him. The Wallace case became a reference point for discussions about financial exploitation, marriage with significant age differences, and the importance of careful estate planning. It demonstrated how private tensions within a household could escalate into criminal acts when trust and intentions were compromised. In the end, the legal process concluded with a firm judgment. Elena's conviction and life sentence closed the case in the courtroom, but the broader impact of the events would continue to be felt by those who had known Richard and by the community that had followed the trial. The conclusion of the Wallace case left a lasting impact on everyone connected to Richard and Elena, as well as on the wider community that had followed the trial. While the legal proceedings had ended with a clear verdict, the human consequences of the crime remained visible long after the courtroom was closed. For Richard's family, the outcome brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. His relatives, though not always close to him in daily life, had respected his discipline and achievements. They had hoped that his later years would be filled with peace and companionship. Instead, they had watched as his marriage ended in betrayal and his life was cut short. The conviction of Elena confirmed their suspicions but also reminded them of how fragile trust could be. Many expressed sadness that Richard's generosity and desire for companionship had been taken advantage of. Richard's close friends and business associates also reflected on the tragedy. They remembered him as someone who had worked tirelessly for decades to build financial stability, only to see his life end in conflict within his own household. Some friends admitted that they had warned him about the risks of marrying so quickly, especially to someone much younger, but they acknowledged that Richard had made his choice seeking comfort in his final years. Their reflections carried a tone of regret, not only for his death but for the loneliness he must have felt in the last months of his life. The community around Richard's neighborhood also felt the impact. Neighbors who had observed the tension between Richard and Elena spoke of their surprise when the truth was revealed. For many, it was a reminder that even in quiet, well-kept suburbs, serious conflicts could remain hidden behind closed doors. Some said the case made them more aware of the importance of looking out for vulnerable individuals, especially the elderly who might be at risk of exploitation. On a broader level, the case prompted discussions about financial protection and estate planning. Legal experts used the Wallace case as an example of why elderly individuals with significant wealth must take careful steps when entering new marriages. Estate planners emphasized the importance of legal safeguards, transparent documentation, and trusted advisors to reduce the risk of financial abuse. The story highlighted that while legal tools could protect assets, they could not always protect individuals from betrayal within personal relationships. For law enforcement and prosecutors, the case was a clear demonstration of how financial motives can drive criminal acts. Investigators later remarked that the key to solving the case was paying close attention to details that at first seemed minor: the toxicology report, unusual financial activity, and digital search history. Without careful examination of these elements, Richard's death might have been dismissed as natural. The successful resolution showed the importance of persistence in cases where circumstances appear suspicious but not obvious at the start. Elena's conviction also carried lessons. Her story became a warning about the dangers of entering relationships motivated by financial gain. While her personal history remained less known, the evidence presented in court showed a pattern of dissatisfaction and impatience that escalated into destructive choices. Her life sentence served as a reminder that financial desperation or ambition does not excuse criminal actions. The Wallace case also left a broader reflection on human relationships. Richard, despite his careful nature in business, allowed personal hope to guide his decisions in his private life. His desire for companionship in his later years led him to trust someone whose intentions were not aligned with his own. The tragedy underscored how emotional needs, when combined with significant financial differences, can create conditions for exploitation and harm. In the end, the impact of the Wallace case extended far beyond the courtroom. It reshaped the way Richard's family remembered him, leaving them with both pride in his life's work and sorrow for its ending. It left his friends with regret that they could not protect him more effectively. It influenced professionals in law and finance, reminding them of their role in safeguarding vulnerable clients. And it left the community with a sense of caution about trust, relationships, and hidden dangers that can exist even in familiar surroundings. The story of Richard and Elena Wallace closed with a firm legal judgment, but its lessons remained open. It was not only a case about wealth and crime, it was also a reflection on human vulnerability, the risks of misplaced trust, and the consequences of choices made without honesty. For those who followed the case, the message was clear. Wealth may bring comfort, but without trust and genuine care, it cannot prevent tragedy.